Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Vedic Astrology podcast. My name is Fiona Marks, and I am your host today. This episode of the podcast, which is going to explore astrology and music. Just like life, Vedic astrology is super complex, and in this podcast, I like to explore these 5 key areas of my interest in astrology. I like to talk about topic 1, what is astrology? Topic 2, how does it work? Topic 3, the main topic that we talk about, is all the techniques and details and specific ways to use Vedic astrology in reading a chart. Then I love to talk to other astrologers. That's my 4th topic. And the 5th topic is case studies of applying these to people's lives or world events. And today we're diving into that 3rd topic of all of the techniques and approaches that make up Vedic astrology. So, as we were saying, Vedic astrology is super complex. It's got lots and lots of different puzzle pieces. And if you are currently on the apprenticeship, you will know exactly what I'm talking about, because our teacher, Ryan Kurziak, has managed to separate into semesters these key areas of astrology and teach them in a building block, step-by-step way. And this means that just like laying the foundations of your house, you build it up layer by layer so that everything can be supported by the layer below. So you need to look at the most basic things and get them laid down first before we can build on top of that. And as you're going through that apprenticeship or another astrology training approach that you're taking, one wonders, how do these things fit together, and when will I ever be able to see how these different pieces form a coherent picture of someone that I'll be able to turn into a reading. And today I want to talk to you about the analogy of Vedic astrology and comparing that to an orchestra playing music. If you are studying that apprenticeship, you will remember that Ryan talks a lot about an example of fields and seeds, so a farming kind of example, and I think that is really good as well. We might explore that in the podcast at another date. But today I want to try to explore how you unpack a birth chart, how you understand all of those elements, just like it was a sheet of symphony music. This is one of my absolute favorite things to do, is to listen to a live orchestra playing. For me, that is stress relief. That is my spa. That is my zen. It is magic. So, of course, when I want to understand astrology, I'm going to be looking in that world to understand it. So, for me, I love the idea of the conductor coming in, walking in at the start of the symphony with all of these amazing tools at their disposal and everything written on a few sheets of paper and producing, if it's Beethoven's Ninth Symphony or something, 70 minutes of music of absolute harmony and perfection, all encoded in those several pieces of paper. And I think that this is really useful. Looking at an analogy like this is useful if you are a student trying to put together all the different and valuable pieces of the astrology puzzle. It's also useful if you're a client who's going for a reading or been for a reading, to get an idea of how your astrologer turns all of those numbers and symbols on the screen into a reading. And just like the conductor and the musicians make sense of their sheet music, that is what the astrologer is trying to do as well. They're trying to hear the music of your energetic DNA in their head as they examine the strength and the layout and the timing of your internal orchestra. So I hope you will join me as we explore this orchestra and sheet music as an analogy. Obviously, it is not a perfect analogy, and I think some of the comparisons are super useful, and maybe some of the other ones are a little bit of a stretch. So I welcome you to come on this journey with me and share your thoughts and insights too, with what you agree and disagree with my comparisons. Now let us begin by looking at the fundamentals of the birth chart. We've got the signs, houses, and planets as a fairly fundamental layer that we need to have as a framework for astrology. And then as we come into Vedic astrology, we have dignities, potencies, Avasthas, Vargas, and timing. So if I just restrict myself, I'm looking at that list, I think it's 8. If I just restrict myself to these kind of key elements, key puzzle pieces of Vedic astrology, how can we take each of those and see what orchestral music can add to our understanding of bringing all of these different pieces together? And let's begin with signs. Signs are fundamental to astrology, and they are like the soil that the experience grows out of. They're that fundamental. So for me, in this analogy, I feel that the musical key that the piece of music is written in could be an analogy for the signs. The key is the harmonic foundation of a piece of music. And although theoretically anything can be transposed from one key to another key, each unique musical key gives a colour of its own to the music. And this was very well known in earlier times, and composers would write in specific keys, and the audience would know what was meant by that key. It was something that had a meaning among the culture and the time. And perhaps it's something that we have detached from a little bit now as music enthusiasts. We just listen as it comes. But I'm going to read for you some translations of the meanings of each key from a book that was written in Germany in 1806, which I don't even know how you would translate the German title, but where I'm reading it from is called The Effective Musical Key Characteristics. For example, if a piece of music is written in C major, the emotion or the color that is transmitted by that key is completely pure. Its character is innocence, simplicity, naivety, children's talk. So 200 years ago and earlier, when a composer wanted to communicate something pure and innocent, they would choose to write it in C major. However, right next door, if we just go down these in alphabetical order, C minor, declaration of love, and at the same time, the lament of unhappy love. All languishing, longing, sighing of the lovesick soul lies in this key. And it keeps going. D major, a key of triumph, of hallelujahs, of war cries, of victory rejoicing. Thus, the inviting symphonies, the marches, the holiday songs, heaven rejoicing choruses are set in this key. Whereas D minor, melancholy, womanliness, the spleen and the humours brood. E flat major, the key of love, of devotion, of intimate conversations with God. And it goes on and on. F major, compliance and calm. F minor, deep depression, funeral lament, groans of misery, and longing for the grave. And on. There are many musical keys, more than 12, so that's a little bit where it doesn't cross over. But as I read these descriptions of the emotional messages that are transmitted by each musical key, it so reminded me of those descriptions of the signs from Lajjitaadi, which I think we've covered in other podcasts. And do you hear that as well in these descriptions, that each key reminds you a little bit of some of the statements that we have in these ancient texts about each sign, and how the key of music itself is going to give a quality to the whole message of that music. Before we leave the keys of music as signs, we can also think about the Rasi aspects between the signs being a little bit about musical keys that go together. You know how for Rasi aspects we say that if it's a cardinal sign, it's aspected by all of the fixed signs except the one next to it. And this is also like keys are like that as well. They go very well in the fifths away from each other. And something about that reminds me of the Rasi aspects. You know how they're a little bit clunky about how far away they are from each other. So in music, C major and A minor go well together, G major and E minor. So I think that this could be a way to look at Rasi aspects in the keys of music. So that might describe signs for us. Up next, let's look at houses. Houses are perhaps a little harder to match to the music in a way. Houses tell us where the karma is going to take place in the person's life. So as the astrologer who's trying to read the chart, this is where we're listening for where this karma will manifest itself in the person's life. And for me, the houses have always told the hero's journey. And you guys who follow me already will know that my first video for Ryan was about Rahu and Ketu and the hero's journey. So if you want to catch up on that, you can see that video. But if we stand back from the houses a little bit, we see that there's a progression from the first house. One way to look at it is this progression of the hero starting off on the journey, going through all of those trials and coming out the other end, bringing the elixir or the golden chalice or whatever mythological object is desired by the village or by the culture, and then the hero transcending and leaving the story. When we think of that with astrology, we have that hero's journey kind of repeated in 3 segments. So from house 1 to 4 is very much the initial journey of the hero, beginning the story, exploring the resources that's required, the adventure, the courage, finding the territory, and then building a home. That's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then from 5, 6, 7, 8, we are transacting with others. We're taking that journey and we're out in the real world in relationship, going through obstacles and being tested, repeating that same rhythm. And then 9, 10, 11, 12, we are bringing the fruit of that trial. Now we've learned that lesson, we're applying it, and we're returning home to the village with this new knowledge and giving it and leaving the story. So for me, in music, the thing that is similar to that is the musical themes in a symphony. So the first movement, the second movement, the third movement, the fourth movement. And I just looked this up on classical music, the movements of a symphony for dummies. You remember those books that used to be like, this is from classical music for dummies. So if we think about the first movement in a piece of symphony music, generally it is brisk and lively, it's an allegro. And for me, that matches nicely with the first house, the Dharma and inspiration. It's got that Dharmic energy of what's inspiring us to move forward. The second movement is often slow and lyrical. It's an andante or adagio. And for me, this also goes well with that second house, gathering resources. If we think about that second sign of Taurus being a little slower, being that fixed sign. So second movement, second house. The third movement is dancey. It's a minuet or a scherzo. And in the houses, the third house is the first karma house. It's exploring our desires. I think dancey goes really nicely with that. And the fourth movement is rollicking, lighter in character, doesn't have a great deal of emotional depth, but has a form all of its own. So it's a bit more freedom with this fourth movement. And in the houses, the fourth house is the moksha house and that transcending spiritual house. And really, those moksha houses do have an energy that's completely different from the 1, 2, 3 that have led up to that. Moksha enlightenment is at a completely different resonating level, or got different goals entirely from the first three. So for me, these movements, the first, second, third, fourth movement, map really nicely with those houses as they repeat. So then the fifth house would go back to being a first movement, brisk and live, Dharma setting the inspiration. The sixth house becomes that second movement, slow and lyrical, Arthur. You get the idea. So for me, could we imagine that the houses are like the themes in the symphony music score that are peppered throughout, but have these main movements where they are expressed? A difference that I would like to point out, of course, is that a symphony is only played sequentially, whereas life charts and birth charts and life, they're happening concurrently. So whereas a symphony, when it's being played for an audience, is played from beginning to end along those musical themes that I've just outlined, a birth chart, the first house is playing at the same time as the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth, all at the same time. All those 12 houses are playing. However, of course, that we do know that we have timing in Vedic astrology. There are several ways of looking at timing, and in those timing methodologies, we do see certain houses are highlighted at certain times in the person's life. So you may agree with me or you may not agree with me that houses and symphony movements go together, but this is the way that I think about it. Okay, so we've looked at signs being key signature, and we've looked at houses as being the movements of the symphony. What's next? Let's look at planets, another very foundational element of Vedic astrology, and really important for me. Planets are the instruments that the musicians play in the orchestra. Remember that planets are grahas. They are the grabbers of our consciousness, and they are the part of the chart that we can consciously work with. And I like that for the musical instruments because we have that chance to have so much variety in how each musical instrument is expressing itself, and it has a musician being the conscious element. But how do we match planets to instruments? Now, this is where I also invite your feedback. I spoke at copious length with my wonderful friends who play in the orchestra, who I admire so much and really appreciate their insights into musical theory and the work that they do. And there are many ways that we could go about this, and there are many different people who have approached this problem before, I'm sure. For me, for our podcast today, I would like to allocate instruments based on their elements, that is fire, water, air, and earth. And I'm doing that because the orchestra has 4 main sections. It has the brass section, percussion, wind, and strings. And I would like to match up my astrological elements, fire, water, air, and earth, with brass, percussion, wind, and strings. So for me, Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter, we know that they have a kinship together because they rule the fire and the water signs. They rule those Dharma and Moksha places. Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter. Whereas Mercury, Venus, and Saturn, They rule the air and the earth signs on the chart. That is the Karma and the Artha signs. So for that reason, I am matching Sun, Moon, Mars and Jupiter with brass and percussion. I'm thinking Sun, perhaps a heralding trumpet. You know, those long, golden, beautiful, shining heralding trumpets that sound out direction, vision. They're bright, they're shiny. I'm imagining that's the Sun. Moon, I'm thinking percussion like piano, harp, xylophone, something calming and liquidy, something maybe that harmonizes with other instruments. Mars, I'm thinking snare drum, bass drum, driving the orchestra into action, maybe even a gong or those tubular bell things when Mars is in Scorpio. And Jupiter, I've been told that the trombone is the voice of God. That was news to me. I've never really had much connection to the trombone myself. So possibly it's trombone, voice of God. Or I wonder about French horn, that full golden rounded sound of the French horn that manages to be brass, but at the same time manages to have a softness or an inclusiveness that perhaps other brass instruments do not have. Okay, so these are my stabs at the Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter being brass and percussion, leaving me with Mercury, Venus and Saturn to embody the wind and the strings. I'm thinking of Mercury as like a piccolo, you know, a little high flute that can really run around the orchestra with all of its notes connecting everything. Of course, lute. We also have Gemini, one of the twins in Gemini holding a lute. You know, maybe take your pick there. I think I'm going to stick with piccolo myself. Venus, I'm thinking like the sensual reeds, like the oboe or maybe a flute, sensual wind instrument. Leaving me with Saturn as the strings. That is a slow, low double bass, or maybe even like stressed under pressure violin can be really jarring, you know. So you may agree with those matchups or not. Obviously, every instrument has so much depth and variety, just like every planet, trying to get them a perfect match. But I do like that the Tamasic planets, Mars and Saturn, they end up with instruments made up of animal skins, like drums, or strings made out of, you know, cat's guts and horse tails. So I kind of like that crossover. And, you know, if Saturn is the violin section, I like that it takes a lot of Saturns to be heard, you know, that they're the hard workers of the audience, of the orchestra, because really they're playing pretty much all the time. They form the basis of the music, and in some ways they go unnoticed as individuals. You know, they're a body rather than just having one of them. You need a whole bunch. So perhaps you will give me the leeway there to keep going with instruments as planets. And then we can see these kind of natural friendships that we like so much in Vedic astrology, perhaps playing out with the instruments, that the brass and percussion do tend to go well together. The strings and the wind also tends to go for each other. Perhaps we don't have those enemy relationships that you do see in Vedic astrology. I wonder whether trumpets hate double basses and double basses hate trumpets, or do trumpets as the Sun hate flutes as Venus and flutes as Venus hate the trumpets? I'm not sure. But maybe we could see how a drum would hassle out a double bass, you know, and do that Mars starvation, Lajjitaadi Avasthas. And maybe the piccolo does get on the nerves of any drummer, giving as well that Lajjitaadi Avasthas of Mercury starving Mars. And Can the French horn be seduced by the oboe and hassled by the piccolo? I don't know. These are things for us now to discuss in our analogy of the orchestra. I look forward to your thoughts. But I do see that the main friendship groups, that is the Sun, Moon, Mars and Jupiter, hanging out, brass and percussion. You've got that sense of righteousness, of bossing the rest of the orchestra around. You could imagine them happily, being a marching band, telling us all what to do and motivating us and guiding, leading from the front. So they've got that kind of energy, whereas Mercury, Venus and Saturn, they're perhaps more pragmatic, dealing with harmony, dealing with melody. They're like a little Baroque or little chamber orchestra that could happen quite happily without the hassling out of the brass and the percussion. So maybe we've got some of the analogy crossing over there. All right, so now we have 3 basic analogies. And can you feel how we're beginning to get some flow and richness with our astrology insights now? Some instruments are going to do well in certain musical key signatures, and they're going to struggle in other keys. And some movements are going to lend themselves to certain key signatures. As we spoke about, you can imagine supposing to have this allegro, upbeat, first house, first movement kind of energy, and it's written in one of those melancholy F minor, deep depression, funeral lament kind of keys. And some instruments do well in certain movements of music and others don't do so well. So now we've got our fundamentals laid out there. I can almost see like dignities springing up in front of my eyes. And just staying with like what you're experiencing as we think of the orchestra as a birth chart, and we begin to slip into this dignities conversation, that's when we see that the seating arrangements of the orchestra are really important. So let's all of us close our eyes and think back to the last time you were at a symphony or when you were watching one on television. Just notice where you see that layout of all the musicians in the orchestra. We've got the violin sitting in the front, starting from the left, moving into violas and double basses as that front row arches all the way around from left to right. So you've got those strings kind of in a big arch at the front. Then we've got the wind instruments behind. We've got the brass behind them, and we've got the percussion at the back. And perhaps we've got a piano or a harp off onto that left side. And this orchestra, this is like the Dolby surround sound in a physical layout. It's a seating arrangement that can give us many useful additions to our analogy. We begin to see dignity, which is where we're going straight away, then Lajjitaadi, Avasthas, and even Shadbala. So let's imagine ourselves now sitting in that orchestra or seeing the way that the orchestra is laid out. And let's look at dignity, starting with proud. We've got a proud planet. Maybe it's a soloist. It's standing out among the crowd in its natural environment. It's in its zone. And Mula Trikona coming down the dignities is maybe like being the first violin. You know how they have those leaders of each section. Whereas we might have Own Home as being second instrument in its section. And Great Friend is not in those key positions, but is well in its section. Maybe it's, in the right place next to the first and second leaders of the section. Friend is maybe not in its section, but with its friendship group. So if it's brass, it's not sitting in the brass section, but it's with the percussion section. Or if it's the wind, it's not sitting in the wind section, but it's with the strings. It's still nearby, still feels like it's with its friends. Then perhaps if we get to neutral, we think of an instrument that is, unfortunately, it's not in its section, but it has space around it and it can still hear itself and maybe see what's going on around it. Whereas enemy would be, not only is it not in its section, but it's in the wrong friendship group. You know, we've got our violin stuck out there in the percussion section or something. And then great enemy is something like, not only is it not in its section, it's also in the wrong friendship group, but it's really surrounded, like packed with those enemy instruments. And if it's debilitated, not only is it not in its section, in the wrong friendship group, surrounded by enemies, but it's just unable to be heard by its colleagues or without view to its colleagues, so really quite isolated, we could imagine. And I think that this gives us a sense of how planets struggle with their different dignities or excel on where they are placed in relation to other instruments in the orchestra. So that's dignity, and it lends itself naturally to talking about aspects, planetary aspects, which lends itself to talking about Lajjitaadi Avasthas. So you can imagine in these seating arrangements, all the instruments are having relationships with each other, and they can see other instruments and they can not see other instruments. So if you think about the way the violins or the strings are at the front, they can't see anyone behind them, right? And then the wind can see the violins in front of them, but they can't see the brass or the percussion. You know, so we have these aspects of where instruments can see each other. And if you're on a far edge of the left arch, you can see the people all over to the other side, whereas maybe if you're right in the middle of that orchestra setup, you can't see because there's just too much going on. You can't see the edges. So let's take this analogy and see what we can find out. That was aspects. If we looked at Lajjitaadi Avasthas, perhaps delighted is being seen by friendly colleagues in the orchestra, and they can help you keep time and rhythm and pitch. They make eye contact with you, they smile at you, they cheer you up, or they keep you going. And maybe if we think of Jupiter as this French horn, this full round sound, maybe every instrument just feels special being next to the French horn, and they feel important, they feel cheered up. Conversely, starvation might be eyeballing unhelpful colleagues who are always putting you off your rhythm and pitch, and they're giving you those mean looks, and when you're doubting yourself, they just look mean and they put you off. Or maybe if we think of Saturn as being the double bass, you're sitting right next to it. It just takes up so much space. You can't move as much with your own instrument because this big instrument is next to yours with big arm movements of the bow going back and forwards, and it's quite a deep, loud sound that's just melancholy no matter what it plays. You know, it's got a heaviness, let's say, to the sound that it makes, and you might be trying to make quite a different melody, but being next to the double bass, you feel restricted, starved. But maybe even worse, you're being right next to the loudest, brightest, most righteous, the most beautiful heralding trumpet of the orchestra, and you just feel inadequate, next to this confident, gleaming, dharmic heralding trumpet, and you get frustrated that you'll never be seen. You're agitated next to the sun. Or perhaps even worse, you're in charge of the fifth movement. You're in the fifth movement. You've got a malefic enemy instrument next to you, or you're in any movement, any theme of the symphony. But not only are you with a malefic enemy, you're with Rahu and Ketu, and they manage to ostracize you. So you're not even sitting in the orchestra at all. You're kind of off to the side. You can't see anyone. And you're just ashamed that you haven't even held your own in the orchestra space, off there on your own. Perhaps these are the Lajjitaadi Avasthas based on where we would be sitting, who we'd be sitting with in the orchestra. And this gives us an idea of the complexity that all of us are dealing with our own planets and layout in our own birth chart, is that There can be multiple versions of all of those layouts that we just spoke about happening at the same time. So it can be very conflicting inside the person. Some elements going very well, some movements going very well, or some instruments going really well and other instruments or movements really struggling. And that brings us nicely to talk about Shadbala. Can we describe Shadbala in terms of the orchestra as well? Shadbala, if you remember, describes the potencies and the strengths of each planet based on a myriad of factors. We're just going to have a look at the six main summary levels of Shadbala. We've got Sthanabala, positional strength. Perhaps this is how many members are in each section. Is this orchestra really strong on pianos or really strong on violins? And we all know the ideal orchestral setup, but maybe this particular birth chart is showing, which sections of the orchestra have a lot. Maybe there's lots and lots of piccolos in this particular orchestra. Then our second strength, Digbala, directional strength. Can the instrument see the conductor? Can the conductor see the instrument? How much communication is going on between the conductor and the instrument? Kalabala is temporal strength. Perhaps we could think about this as how many things suit the particular instrument that we're looking at, like the key signature. Does it suit the instrument? The tempo, does it suit the instrument? The note lengths, does it suit the instrument? And go through all of those elements of the music and see how many of those go well with French horn or go well with violin. Then we have Ayanabala, declinational strength, which in astrology is how far away it is from the equator. But in the orchestra is how far away it is from the conductor. Some instruments work well when they're near the conductor, and some work much better when they're far away. So we could imagine all of those if those big percussion instruments end up right in front of the conductor. It doesn't work well for the instrument. It doesn't work well for the orchestra. It doesn't work very well for the conductor either. So where is the layout? And Chestabala is our emotional strength. And I'm wondering whether this is the time someone has to care for their instrument over time. Is the person racing in just to play the symphony and leave, or have they had time to practice and maintain their instrument? They've had time to clean it after the symphony. They've developed a care and a confidence with this instrument. Chestabala. And Drikbala, personal favorite, aspectual strength. Are there musicians actively, other musicians actively stealing your reeds or your spare strings? Or maybe there are other instruments, other musicians actively making sure that you have spare strings when you need them. So this could be Drikbala. So I think that the orchestra, the layout, gives us a way to understand Shadbala in a very visceral way, giving us the dynamics of this orchestra. Let's move on to Vargas, my maybe absolute favorite analogy between astrology and music. Vargas or harmonic charts. I found it hard when I was learning Vargas to wrap my head around the Vargas and how to, conceptually I understand the concept of Vargas, but how do you read that in a person's chart and in such a way that will be helpful to that person? So I think in music, a great analogy is, have you ever noticed how a middle C or a note played on the piano, the cello and the trumpet or any other instrument, they sound completely like a middle C, but also completely different from all other instruments. And you may have heard that called the timbre, or the tone color. And another way that you can describe it is the harmonic resonance. Basically, it is saying that each instrument has a unique pattern of resonating tones that it generates when it's playing the main note. So if you were to generate a pure middle C, it would just be like one frequency, one wave, and it wouldn't be very rich at all. It's just a very plain one wave. But each instrument, when it plays that middle C, is at the same time playing a whole lot of harmonic frequencies that are related to that note, meaning that the main note, middle C, is what comes through, supported by all of these other frequencies. This is why I like it for Vargas, because when we are thinking about Vargas, we're always interested in that main or fundamental note. That is the D1 chart, the Rasi chart. But the quality of the harmonic tones or the overtones, they bring a richness to the sound of the instrument and to the orchestra. If an instrument is weak in some of these overtones, the fundamental tone, that main note, will not sound as rich and full. Whereas if the instrument is weak in the main tone, the main note, but it might be rich in the overtones or the harmonic, it can produce a very pleasing sound that maybe won't be strong at first listening. And Varga charts are like a spectrum analysis, allowing us to evaluate the richness of the individual planet's contribution to a person's life. I love that for Vargas because I think Vargas are so important, but really can't be separated from that main note. And I love how different instruments have a different blend of all of those harmonic notes. And you can imagine an instrument that is weak in certain harmonic notes that just won't produce those results. You know, even though everything else is right about it and it's hitting the right note in the main chart, in the Rasi chart, there's something weak in that harmonic related, we could say, to the Navamsha or the Dasamsha or whatever particular chart you're listening to. So let me know what you think of that as an analogy. Okay, now there's a few odds and sods that we should wrap up here in the analogy. Maybe we could just touch on things like the Balaadi Avasthas. They're based on the number of degrees into a sign a planet is. And this could be like the age of the musician or the number of years that person has been playing. And the Jagradadi Avasthas, they're based on the dignities. But for this analogy, we could think of them as the ability of the musician to concentrate. You know, if they're awake, they've got a Jagrat, they've got clear sight to the conductor and they're surrounded by their colleagues. If they're asleep, you know, they're in the wrong musical section, they don't have a line of sight to the conductor or to their colleagues, you know, so their ability to concentrate on what's happening in the orchestra is quite impacted. All right, so where does that leave us? This is what my experience of preparing for a reading is like. I am looking at the sheet music and I'm listening to how this unique orchestra is going to make the sound, how they're going to play this music. And what about the conductor? Now, just like a birth chart is missing planet Earth, obviously it's not, because planet Earth is the ascendant, it's the Lagna. But when we look at the planets laid out there on the birth chart, we don't see Earth as a symbol there. And what is missing from the analogy here is the conductor. And for me, the conductor of the orchestral music is the birth chart person. That's the person themselves. It's the awareness. How aware is this person? The musicians, they all have their individual scores, and they could play their notes without a conductor. Maybe they've just got a metronome going tick, 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 they could play. But if the conductor can be present and alert, they can bring out the best in the orchestra. They are like giving those signals, a bit louder over here, slow down, you guys, in that section. They're tweaking with the sound production as it's occurring. So that's the conductor for me. It's the person. And then that brings us to timing. And maybe orchestras and timing techniques we need a whole nother podcast for. Could the Vimshatari Dashas be actually conductors that come in and run that part of the music? And they were previously musicians in a particular instrument. So they're going to inevitably focus on that instrument and the key signatures and the movements that work for them. So maybe Vimshatari Dashas are like biased conductors, that come in, do their 7 years or their 16 years of leading the orchestra with a particular bias on their favorite movements and their favorite instruments, maybe. And then our perfections, that we go through one house every year, is that like repeating the symphony over and over and over again in time, one movement at a time, that we're getting a chance to practice. And our transits, like visiting musicians who come in and bolster a particular section, or maybe they come in and they mess up other sections. They really throw out the balance of what was going well in that particular orchestra by sending in lots of, piccolos or lots of flutes or lots of oboes, whatever it is that's going on. And then that brings me pretty much finally, the one that I have been leaving out is Rahu and Ketu. And I've left them to the end because really we know that Rahu and Ketu are not planets in the way that we think about heavenly bodies. They are disembodied, they're ghost planets. And so for me, Ketu is perhaps the super experienced musician who comes into any section with hundreds of pencil notes on their score from all the countless times that they have played this piece of music for hundreds and hundreds of different conductors. They are stuck in Groundhog Day. They're a Groundhog Day musician whose expertise has been honed and honed and honed, but is out of time with the present. They're doomed to repeat the same experience no matter what they do. And is Rahu that bizarre young musician who won't even wear the blacks? How the orchestra is always in their black uniform, and is obsessed with experimenting with their instrument. They want to play it in water. They want to put grains of rice on it if it's the drum. They want to play with half the strings covered or half the holes covered. They're a potential virtuoso who is half genius, half mad scientist, and cares not for convention, but wants to take risks and experience all that their instrument can do. So how do we put this all together as we look at a chart? What are some examples that spring to mind for you? Let me share a few that spring right out for me. What about a sun exalted, a herald's trumpet, golden, burnished and bright, standing tall in his section, commanding attention and guiding all like a beacon, competing with an exalted flute, sensual, feminine, liquid, seducing. The sun's Jupiter, the sun is near those French horns, but the flute is just managing to seduce this French horn, so it keeps losing its timing. It's not focusing on the herald anymore. It's watching this beautiful flute in its sensual moment and trying to support it, delighting it with whatever the French horn can do for that exalted flute. And while this flute is trying to keep up with those sensual notes of the flute, we've got this high and fast notes of the piccolo, ruining the French horn's rhythm, cutting him off entirely from that glorious heralding trumpet? Or do we have Saturn, a first lord, on the double bass, supposed to be in charge of this lively and bold start to the first movement, but sitting in the third house, surrounded by 27 snare drums, as this chart is very strong on Mars Shadbala. And the double bass is just being intimidated by Mars, by these snare drums, constantly speeding it up and trying to hold on to this allegro or this minuet kind of pace of the movements of these first and third movements. And double bass is getting really stressed by all this pressure of the beat and the fast pace of the drums. But whenever they can, the piccolos are standing up and they're turning to face the double bass, who's stuck over there in the percussion session. And the piccolos standing up and looking at the double bass are just using their friendship to help keep that double bass going. And then the oboes join in Saturn's first movement melody and reassure that double bass that it's all going to be worth it, that it's going well, and he's going to reap the rewards of his attention and doing his best. Or the piccolo and the flute, who love to run away with the happiness of the melody, and they get stuck with the double bass between them, and that no matter what they do or how the double bass tries, it just can't be light and silly with them. So both the piccolo and the flute feel a bit heavy and restricted. Or perhaps it's that every instrument just feels delighted being next to that gentle French horn Jupiter, who coaxes more joy out of them than they ever thought was possible. Or a wind section that's been doing so well under a conductor, but now they're stifled and silenced by a strong brass call to action crescendo under this new Vimshatari conductor who loves to stimulate the brass section in the orchestra. So this is how I think about what's unfolding as I'm reading the chart and all of these elements bringing together in my ears the sound that the chart is making. And I think it helps astrologers to realize how complex preparing a chart is. It inspires us that composers wrote all of this so it can be understood, just like the most complex piece of music, it can be understood. And as students, it helps us to see the complexity in the chart, that it does come together, and it helps us be realistic about how long it takes to be a good astrologer, because you can't land a gig in the orchestra on your first day of picking up reading sheet music. It's something, working with the orchestra takes years of practice and baby steps as we build up to that those musicians that we see in front of us in the symphony orchestra have been playing their whole lives, from their little practicing in their bedrooms, from being in bands in primary school, from being in orchestra camps in high school, through to their university education, and practice every day by themselves. And I think this helps us be realistic as students of astrology, that the symphony sounds amazing and it comes from years and years of dedication and practice. And as clients, an analogy like this helps us to realize that all charts are out of balance. They have wonderful things and they have disharmonious things. And whereas a composer is striving to communicate one inspiration through their symphony, in real life, the charts have jumbles of inspiration. They have some themes that are consistent with each other. They have some themes that are in conflict with each other. And with the help of an astrologer, a client can work on improving their symphony experience of their life by understanding these discordant elements, and by doing our job as the conductor of our own symphony, bringing up those parts that are working well, knowing how to handle the discordant parts of our symphony. Sometimes it's going to be more practice. Sometimes it's going to be giving less energy to those parts and not getting sucked into what's not working with that part of the musical piece. Each case is going to be different, and this is something that the astrologer can work with you on. So, what did you think? Do you agree or disagree? Do you think it's helpful to look at the birth chart as a symphony score? And what would you change from what we've discussed today? I noticed, for example, that I did not use timing signatures, which are fundamental to music. So I'd be interested whether you think 3/4 time and 4/4 time and all of the other time signatures, are they, have I left them out? Should they have been mapped to one of these pieces of Vedic astrology? I also didn't talk about the notes themselves, and I think notes are very powerful too. How would you include them? I look forward to your thoughts, and I hope you will join me again the next time that we get together for the Vedic Astrology podcast. Until then, best wishes and stay well.